Welcome to NCHS Current Podcasts. I'm news editor Isabella Madrid, and we have a really awesome conversation planned for today. Here with me is Editor-in-Chief Ryan Boulanger, and we are so lucky that New Canaan Public Schools Superintendent Dr. Bryan Luizzi and English teacher Arri are joining us to talk about the importance of artificial intelligence and its impact on our education system. Thank you for joining us.
Great to be here.
Yes,
of course.
So I wanted to start in January 2023 with the release of ChatGPT's first model to the public. I think it was met with a lot of initial reactions of panic and fears of the end of writing, a lot of concerns about plagiarism, and it led me as a student to be kind of timid about using it, especially in my sophomore year. As an underclassman, I read news articles about people being kicked out of college for plagiarism, and so I think even now, I'm still almost a little nervous about using this tool for my work being flagged. And so I think that leads me to sort of an inquiry about practical applications of these tools and the question of what's going to make a student who has similar concerns as me comfortable using this AI in a classroom.
Well, I'll jump right in. I think that your reaction in 2023 when it first was released was understandable and common. If you'll recall, going back there, the colleges and universities instantly banned it from campus across the board and did say exactly that. Anyone caught using it could be penalized for plagiarism and kicked off campus, and people didn't know what to make of it. What we did here was put a group of teachers, administrators, and leaders together and start studying it right away. And that has led to some really good and I think interesting discoveries and understandings and trying to work forward, knowing that we weren't going to just be able to put a blanket ban in place and keep it out any more than you could do that with a calculator years ago when that was invented and math teachers everywhere panicked. So to your question about sort of what does it mean, for you, like how do you get past that fear? I think that it's understanding its role and keeping it in its role. Right? I think best serves us not as a replacement for the work, but as sort of a co-pilot sometimes when we want to use it, need to use it in order to enhance or improve what we're doing. It shouldn't replace the work that we do, but make us better at what we're doing. And we can talk about what that means a little bit and how to draw the distinction between those two things. One of the things that I keep in mind is if it's a task where the effort is the point, then it's not a good AI task. That's something that we should be doing on our own. If it's something that is a rote kind of task, something that's repetitive and just the point is getting it finished in order to go on and do something else, then maybe AI could play a role. But there's lots more to it than that. But when we put this group together, now, well over a year ago, and they started working and meeting monthly and doing some work, and Ms. Weeks was part of that, and all of the conversations and things that we've been doing. We really knew that the first step was to understand it, because we didn't want to create rules and guardrails and try to sort of ban or whatever without first understanding what it was, how it worked, what we could do with it. Much like you couldn't really set the rules of the road without knowing how to drive a car, right? So that was the group of teachers and administrators and folks that got together. It was in that spirit, and we've continued to meet, and we've expanded that out to include other teachers and students and parents and community members so that we could sort of do this all together, because we also didn't want it to be sort of a dictum from on high and everyone must do this. We want to do this together because it changes so regularly, and there's so much to learn about how it can help us and help us do the things that we need to do in a better, more creative, sometimes more interesting way without having it actually replace the learning and the outcomes and our ability to continue to grow.
Yeah, definitely.
I think what Dr. Luizzi is talking about is really your philosophy on education. And listening to someone this morning, John Warner, who's an English teacher and writes about writing, and how that's transactional. In many cases. So if it's just about getting the grade and rote memorization and turning it in, then okay, I can understand why you turn to chat. But if it's about developing your critical thinking, your experience in seeing the world, how you're forming as a person, then that's not going to help. It can help you do that and making you think of things that you haven't thought of, like in the ways that I talked about it being a writing partner, but not do the writer for you.
Yeah, that sort of makes me think of, again, like this bigger picture of, should learning be efficient? Because a lot of what artificial intelligence does, I think, is become a tool to complete work more efficiently. And learning, I think, a lot of the times there's this step of in between, which is the struggle. Mm-hmm. And I think AI takes away from that. So I think a lot of this AI literacy is going to come down to in what ways and what assignments can we cut back on this struggle to make students' lives easier, and in what ways is it necessary that they need to be doing this work on their own?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to frame it, because you're right. If the effort is the point and the struggle is the point and that process is the point. You know, I was an English teacher, as Arri does, and as such, when we had papers to write and things to do, it was all process. It wasn't just see you in 2 weeks and give me your final draft and you're done, right? It was the process of going through it that really mattered to get to a point of very clear writing, because clear writing is clear thinking. And if we have AI do the writing for us, then we're not going through that messy process of coming up with an idea, creating a draft, revising that draft, clarifying it, reading it for different audiences, doing all of those things that teach us to be good thinkers as well.
I think this conversation sort of brings us to what a lot of the obstacles are, like the ethical considerations of plagiarism and misinformation within the classroom that can be dangerous for students. And I specifically asked Ryan to come on the podcast because I know he has a little bit of an aversion to these AIs. So I wanted to hear a little bit what you have to think in terms of the ethical considerations.
Yeah, so I can tell you, I remember exactly the moment when we heard about OpenAI releasing the first large language model, ChatGPT. I think it was almost a year ago, or over that, in my sophomore year. I was sitting in math class, and my friends and I were in the back corner, and one of them pulled out their computer, and they're like, "Yo, look at this! Look at this tool! It can do everything. It can write an essay. It can do math. It can code. It can make images." And from there, it got bigger and it got smarter. And obviously, we know it's not a conscious machine. And looking into it further, we know that all a large language model is taking words from all over the internet, from all over people using it, and formulating those words into a sentence that makes sense. And then there's obviously problems with it. There's things like hallucinations, where the AI can just take words that make no sense and come up with fake information, and people believe it, which is a problem. But I'm, as a student, I'm very, very concerned to use it sometimes, because I've seen firsthand how students try to play it off as their work, and it can, like you guys say, take away from the struggle that learning is supposed to be sometimes. But I've also seen it, like Dr. Luizzi said, be used like calculators when they first came out. Like maybe it forces us to think about education in a way that's more creative and more different, because like when calculators came out, before that students had to do arithmetic by hand. And now they're able to do it on a calculator, and now we're able to do more advanced and more forward-thinking math and science and all sorts of things. So it's something that I'm concerned about as a student now, but I'm looking to you guys and all other people around me to see how it can grow and how it can help us grow as students and as leaders.
That's right. Yeah, I think that as you met the comparison with the calculator, in some ways I like it, some ways I don't. One of the ways I do like it is it's a tool. Right? It's not a total replacement, it's a tool. So how do we use this tool to get better at the things that we're already doing, right? When we think about generative AI. And I think that I heard something very early in all of this that resonated for me, which was essentially it was a statement, AI is not going to replace jobs. But people who know how to use AI are going to take the jobs of people who don't know how to use AI. So as a student, as a learner, and we're all learners, I mean, teachers are learners, that's what gets us into teaching in the first place, what an amazing opportunity to learn things so much more quickly and deeply than before. I mean, the difference between a Google search and a conversation with ChatGPT is exponential. What kind of a conversation you can have with a generative AI versus just doing Google search and having to sort through all of that. Well, coming up with the phraseology and the input and knowing how to ask the question. And to your other point, which is spot on, also knowing when it's wrong, because it doesn't know when it's wrong, and it will convince you that it's right.
Or even just rereading what you're turning in to make sure that it's right.
Yeah.
There's that. Yeah, but it says if it's some, you need to know a little bit about what you're asking it about, or it'll trick you, and you can go down a lot of rabbit holes that way.
But the tricky part in that is, how do you become an expert on that topic without having gone through the struggle and the failures and the actual work of it? Scott Galloway, he's a podcaster in tech, and he talks about how he uses it as a writing partner. He'll, like for his last book, he put in, like, give me the 10 top ideas about financial literacy, because his book was about that. And it came back with 10. 8 he had. 1, he was like, I don't need to talk about that. The other one made him think a little bit. So in using it in something like that is very different than write my book for me. Right?
That's right.
But going back to the calculator, those earlier, younger grades still have to learn how to add, right? And they still need to know 2 + 2 is 4. But they, as we get older and thinking about gradual release, where they're not relying on, where they can incorporate those tools more.
Yeah, something we talked about in class was the sort of more legal aspect of how these generative AI chat bots are being sued over ownership of literature because of the concept of the way that it works, that when you copy and paste writing in, it can take ownership of it. So how do you think this applies in an English class where for example, a student copy and paste a passage from Frankenstein, and then now chat can quote that? How do you think that works?
So I had a student who did an essay on the Nickel Boys. If you take a PDF that shouldn't be online already because it's copyright protected, upload it, you're taking away him and his publishers, Colson Whitehead's publishers, money from the work that they do, right? Like, this is how he earns a living as an artist. He needs to be compensated for that. In the same way that you are students producing your own thoughts, your own writing and prompts, or you put your essay in there, and now it becomes the ownership. And there's 5 major corporations that are controlling chatbots right now. So you're handing over your own intellectual property. I think that is something to be very aware of, and not thinking it's all out there anyways, or social media, that kind of those lessons. But you have to be, I think that literacy needs to play a role in it, and having those ethical conversations.
Yeah, I would agree. If anybody takes something they've written, uploads it, and says, help me make this better, it might, and give whatever parameters you want, you'll get something back, but it then can take what you've written and learn from it. And so you're engaging in that conversation, but you have to do it mindfully of the fact that, or mindful of the fact that when you do it, that property or what you're writing, you're thinking, whatever it might be, could then become in the public domain, because that large language model is learning from what you're uploading. Now, there are some that are walled off, and there's some opportunity to do some other things, but it's all emerging. It's all just coming out now. There are opportunities to do things like create chatbots on your own, even with paid subscription to some of these things. And I think there's very creative and interesting approaches to that. And I think there's some that should definitely be avoided. And so it is about that AI literacy, understanding how it works, what happens after you're using it, what the system does, how the system continues to learn, and being very mindful of the fact that what you put in can be used or reused or learned from by this model that you're using.
But not only that, the companies are profiting off of your submitting that, right?
Well, sure, because the more it learns, the smarter it gets, and so quote unquote, and then the smarter it gets, the more user base it would grow and everything else. So, right, there are really interesting legal questions around this, right? So some of these models have learned from New York Times or from different art collections and different things and music and all, and there's questions about, is it right? Is it appropriate? Because for it to reuse some of the this writing styles, let's say, of the New York Times, or some of the painting styles of certain artists and things like that, I see both sides of that argument. Certainly it learned off of these things, and if they were copyright or protected, maybe it shouldn't. But on the other side of that argument is, don't we all do that? Isn't that the way your brain works? So what if you went to the library, checked out these books, looked through these books, learned from it, and then created something in the likeness of? Have you done something wrong? So it's really, there's some very interesting conversations going on around the role and the rights of these things.
I think I noticed Mrs. Weeks talked about like the privacy and the corporations that control the AI, all these different language models. But something that I noticed is back in 2023, when right after all of these chatbots started to become released to the public, all the way up at the White House, President Biden signed this executive order outlining a bill called the AI Bill of Rights. So that kind of encompassed privacy rights for citizens and preventing eventual discrimination against certain groups or minorities because of the use of chatbots. So I know we looked at in my English class this article from, I believe it was an author from a country in Africa, and the country did not have access to internet. So that country does not then most of the people there do not get to use a chatbot. And chatbots learn and grow and consume from consuming knowledge that is put into them from people all around the world. And as we've learned throughout history, we have a very Eurocentric model of thinking taught in our classrooms and all over the world, just because that's the people writing history. So we have a chance now to say, if the OpenAI and all these different chatbots are going to take information from people only with internet, then how is that going to impact information down the road? So that article that we looked at was basically talking about how the idea that smaller startup AI should be used in order to grow this collective conscience instead of these large corporations controlling things, and then it's really only people and nations that have access and areas that have access to internet. So that's another thing that I think people on Capitol Hill are concerned about.
Yeah, and should be. Completely agree that the model that we're currently working under is, as Ms. Weeks said, 5 or so large companies that are driving all of the work in this and all the innovation. They have the resources to do it, so they're far outpacing anyone else who's trying. And I think that sort of concentration leads to all kinds of problems. I know that there's a lot of awareness on the front end, I believe, in setting these things up and trying to do so in a way that's equitable and representative. But you're right, it's only going to be as good as the input that it takes. And if it scours the internet and if it looks through all kinds of different social medias and it looks at Reddit and it pulls all these things in, then any kind of issue or bias or shortcoming, whatever might be in that data set, could be represented in that large language model. So I think that while being aware of it is one thing, doing something about it is wholly different. And I think it's incumbent upon the people who are creating these multi-billion, if not trillion-dollar sort of future-pointed systems to take all of that into account for humanity's sake. It's a very, very important thing to think about.
Yeah, I think that brings us to sort of how getting a background in AI would be the type of thing that gives NCPS students an edge in the workforce. And I definitely think AI literacy is a next step for us to take, as I think our school system really prides itself on setting the students up for success in college and later on in their careers. I think these conversations about these obstacles lead me specifically to think that's exactly why AI literacy is important in order to productively be using these mediums as a tool, because that just would give, we're going back to those calculators and even Excel. I think I was looking at my senior internships, and a bunch of the more advanced internships they say Excel proficiency. And that's a skill that I don't personally have. And I think in future years, it might be AI proficiency. So
Sure.
How do we think, what is the first step in applying this AI literacy education?
as a first step, I think it's important to frame it correctly. And it's to be sure you don't frame it as a replacement, but as an accelerant. It'll help learning happen more quickly. It'll help tasks be completed more quickly. But the human has to remain in the equation at all times and in control of that. There can be some co-evolving that goes on here where we're learning together and the AI continues to improve and we continue to improve in our use of it and how we use it to accelerate the work that we're doing, or the problem solving that's going on, or the design processes that we're using, whether it's engineering, architecture, whatever. But you still always have to have the human in the equation, both because you can't necessarily trust the output all the time, but also the quality of the output's only as good as the quality of the input. We have to learn to ask the right questions. We have to learn to refine. One of the things another piece around that, so in that regard, I should say, it's not about call and respond and done. It's about learning to get into a conversation. So when I've learned to use these models, as I've continued to use them, I've learned that it's not the first question, but maybe the 21st question that really gets me where I want to be. And it's my thinking and it's reflexive back and forth. So I'll ask a question, get a response, think about that response a little bit, ask a deeper question or a different question and redirect. And I think that's also a literacy, that stick-to-itiveness to get to a result that you can evaluate and assess and see as a high-quality answer and helps me to get the result that I need versus write this for me or do this for me, and that's that.
I just saw a teacher in a middle school classroom. There was some AI tool that was beat the bot. So you had to write, they collectively wrote, and he was going around listening to the students. They're all talking about writing. No, use this word, phrase it this way. Great conversations, right? And then they submitted it to the bot, and they couldn't beat the bot's version of the story. So then they said, can we do it again? And now they're talking about revision. This didn't work. How can we do it? So they never beat the bot, he said, which they were gravely disappointed. But he said, look at all the learning. You guys were writers, in this moment. Right. So those are, I think, the moments to kind of champion and think about in the educational philosophy.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. We mentioned in the beginning, everyone shut it down, right? College campuses everywhere said, don't use this. If you do, whatever. Now they're really shifting to, we expect you to use it. And we expect you to tell us when you're using it. We expect you to tell us how you've used it and how it helped you. And it's becoming, again, more of that tool and that co-pilot, not the replacement, but the accelerant.
Do you have anything to add, Ryan?
I just would say I know there's a series of legislative and policy goals surrounding this. I don't know if you guys know specifically about those. I've heard of Bill number 5 that's been floating around in the state legislature. And then there's some guidelines from the state up in Hartford and Department of Education to, I think one of the main things that's holding us back and jumping right in and trying to integrate all of this in classrooms is, like I said, the privacy concerns. And it says that on the CT State website. But I think just going forward, how are we going to see this? Are we maybe going to have some sort of class or curriculum or something that relates to that? I know going back to financial literacy, and that eventually became part of our curriculum. What do you guys think?
It's an interesting question and around the legislation, I was on a call just this morning with a commissioner and some of her team and some other superintendents, and we have different conversations about legislation and legislative priorities and all those things. I do believe that we underprotect our students, our children online. I think we need to do more to protect their privacy, to protect them in social media, in AI, and all of these things. We really do need to think deeply about this. And there are challenges to it because the kids in the schools aren't where the money is, right? The money is with the big tech companies and the lobbyists and folks that really have a financial incentive to try to minimize legislation around this. So we're going to keep fighting with that. We are, here in New Canaan, we're very strict with the Connecticut Student Data Privacy Act, right? And so we make sure that any vendor, any product that we use signs the pledge, does what they have to do, and manages the data appropriately and in the right ways. That act, if that were expanded nationally, it would fundamentally change things for the better, I think, for student data privacy across the board. I'd love to see that. I don't think that's in the cards, but we at least start from a very good base with the Student Data Privacy Act that we have, which it came out about 10 years ago, and it was very difficult to comply with 10 years ago. So imagine where we'd be if we hadn't, right, if that didn't come out. And there are a lot of states in that boat now where they don't have anything necessarily, and they have a lot of road to make up. So I think that's the first important piece. On the legislation side, what was the second part of your question?
Oh, I was just asking about specific curriculum, but it sounds
There
like
you
you
go.
kind of answered it a little bit.
Yeah, well, actually, on that, just a quick thought. When Microsoft came out with Microsoft Office, schools jumped right in to start teaching Excel and Microsoft Word and PowerPoint. We had classes on all of that. And then over time, we came to realize that we don't need classes because students are using it in their content. I hope a little bit that we can maybe skip the separate classes to teach and go right in the content. What are the appropriate uses? Because learning something like that out of context is very difficult. But learning it in the disciplines, learning it in English, in social studies. So how do you use the generative AI in math? Like, is it a reliable tutor? Can it help you in different ways? How do you use it in social studies versus English versus science? I think that's the way to go. And I think we are, that's why we have this group that's doing the work that they're doing. And we're well on our way to framing some of that out.
No, I agree. I think it's the different applications and thinking about the content and the disciplines. You use Google Slides in every class, but the way in which you use it is different. So.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think sort of what you're talking about is how we would use these tools in different ways in different classrooms is definitely a big part of the conversation. I know last year I would struggle that chat had not adapted to solve AP physics problems yet. And so it was not very beneficial as a tutor for that, but in other ways it makes good practice questions if you input data. So I think I want to move into, lastly, off of this conversation, how can integrating AI into education prepare students for the workplace and balancing these technological innovations with just this understanding and the role of computers, as it's a big part of our life, even more than 10 years ago now.
Sure. So Ms. Weeks mentioned in the beginning, I grew up with technology, believe it or not. As a child, my father was a director of technology. He used to program using punch cards before there were even keyboards. So as I grew up, there were always like the latest and greatest in the house. And things change so rapidly. Right? They just continue to evolve, and that's just the nature of technology and the work in the world. I think one of the ways it helps us is we learn to be learners. We learn that it's not about what you know, it's about how you learn, and that the ability to learn, unlearn, relearn, grow, adapt is really the core skill set. We can talk about technical knowledge and technical information, and it's vitally important that we have that. But we also know a freshman going into college today in a technical field, more than half of what they learn is going to be obsolete by the time that they graduate. So it's really about that process of learning to learn, learning to be a responsible producer of information and a discerning consumer. What's right, what's not, what's accurate? How do I evaluate that? How do I know? Again, even AI with this amazing tool, these unbelievable data sets, these trillion-dollar companies, it gets it wrong, right? So how do I know that? What's the skill set I have? So some of this goes back to our not basic, but our 21st century competency skills, our information technology competency skills, because those practices and those skills will still apply when we think about, is this reliable information? Can I trust it? Is it telling me the truth? And am I producing something in a responsible manner? If I put it out there into the world, is it the right thing? Am I doing so in good faith? I think those are some of those core competencies. The ability to learn, relearn, apply, synthesize, those skills that we learn through the disciplines, and then we apply when we find whatever the path's going to be after school.
You don't study English to all become English majors, right? And the same thing. And I also think in the workforce, your generation is going to be the experts, right? And you're going to be helping other people learn. So the models and teaching and experimenting and finding out what it can do. I mean, that's a very exciting prospect.
Not that we discourage anyone from being an English major.
No, absolutely not. And a teacher.
That's right.
All right, thank you. I really appreciate this conversation today about AI literacy. I think we covered some interesting points from the more legislative approach to also obstacles and opportunities. And thank you again for coming on.
Pleasure to be here.
Thank
Thanks
you.
so